The silence in the penthouse was a living thing. It was heavier than the opulent velvet drapes, more suffocating than the humid Seoul air pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Nia polished a crystal glass, her movements small and precise, trying to make herself invisible. It was a skill she had perfected in her 6 months working for Mr. Kwon Jinwoo. Be silent. Be efficient. Do not be seen. Today, the silence was different. It was mocking. It clung to the ridiculous excess of the room. The 3-tiered birthday cake on the marble island, a masterpiece of buttercream and spun sugar, the platters of untouched galbi, japchae, and delicate jawn growing cold under silver lids, the dozens of champagne flutes standing in a glittering, expectant army. An army with no one to serve. It was Mr. Kwon's birthday. He was 32, and no one had come. Nia risked a glance across the cavernous living space. He was there, a silhouette against the city lights that jeweled the Han River far below. His wheelchair was positioned by the vast window, unmoving. Even from this distance, the severe, perfect cut of his Tom Ford suit was unmistakable. It was a suit built for a man who commanded boardrooms and broke empires, not for a man confined to polished chrome and leather. The suit was a lie. The stillness was the truth. Aries, his golden retriever, rested a heavy head on his master's knee, the only living creature offering comfort. The dog whined softly, a sound that was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Nia's instructions had been clear: remain on standby until the last guest departed. But the party had been scheduled to start 3 hours ago. The staff had been dismissed one by one, their pitying looks sliding off the back of Mr. Kwon's proud, rigid neck. Now, only she remained. She set the glass down, the tiny clink echoing like a gunshot. She should leave. Her shift was over. He wouldn't even notice. He was lost in whatever bitter memories had him in their grip. She started to untie the strings of her simple white apron from behind her dark blue uniform dress. Her fingers fumbled with the knot. That's when she saw it. A tremor in his broad shoulder. A slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. Then, the faint glint of reflected city light on a wet track curving down his cheek. He was crying, not with sound or overt sorrow, but with a silent, profound loneliness that seemed to crack the very air in the room. Kwon Jinwoo, the wolf of Gangnam, the man whose name was a whisper of fear and respect in every corner of the city, was weeping because no one came to his birthday party. Her heart gave a painful, stupid lurch. This was not her business. He was her employer, a dangerous man whose world she could not begin to comprehend. The stories she'd heard from the other staff were enough, of his coldness, his precision, his capacity for a violence that was quiet and absolute. The car accident 6 months ago that had stolen the use of his legs had apparently done nothing to temper the steel in his soul. But the tear changed him. It made him human. Before she could talk herself out of it, before common sense could scream her back into the shadows, Nia did the unthinkable. She dropped her hands from her apron strings. She walked out from behind the bar, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished marble. She moved past the lonely floral arrangements, the scent of lilies thick and funereal. She walked to the island, picked up a silver cake server, and sliced a perfect wedge from the magnificent, untouched cake. She placed it on a fine china plate, added a fork, and carried it across the room. Aries lifted his head and watched her approach, a low rumble starting in his chest. But he didn't bark. She stopped beside the wheelchair. The air around him was cold, scented with the faint, expensive notes of cedar and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. She could see the tension in the cords of his neck, the white-knuckled grip of his hand on the armrest. He had not turned. He was still staring out at the city that had once been his to conquer on foot. Nia crouched down, placing the plate on the small table beside him, her movements fluid and calm. "Happy birthday, Mr. Kwon," she whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and foolish. For a long moment he did nothing. The silence stretched, pulling taut, and she thought she had made a terrible, career-ending mistake. Then he moved. His head turned slowly, and his eyes, dark and depthless as a winter lake, found hers. They were red-rimmed, but the grief in them was already being consumed by something else. Something cold and hard. His hand shot out, his grip closing around her wrist. It was not a gentle touch. It was steel. The strength in his hand, in his arm, was shocking, a stark contrast to the stillness of his lower body. His fingers pressed into the delicate bones of her wrist, a brand of possession. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, gravel and silk, a sound she had only ever heard in brief, clipped commands to his lieutenants. It was not a question of her name, which he surely knew from a file. It was a question of what she was, to dare to approach him, to dare to witness him. She did not flinch. She met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "My name is Nia," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm your maid." His eyes narrowed, searching her face for something, pity, fear, ambition. He found none of it, only a quiet, unnerving stillness that mirrored his own. He looked from her eyes down to the plate of cake, then back to her. The grip on her wrist did not lessen. "The others left," he stated. It was an accusation. "My shift isn't over," she replied, which was a lie. He knew it was a lie. A ghost of something, not a smile, but a shadow of one, touched his lips. "Stay," he commanded, and it was not a request. He released her wrist, leaving behind the imprint of his fingers on her skin. He turned his attention back to the window, a dismissal as clear as if he'd had her thrown out. But he had told her to stay. So Nia stayed. She retreated to the edge of the room, a silent sentinel in a party for two. He did not touch the cake. An hour passed. Then another. The city lights blurred into a watercolor painting outside. Aries fell asleep, snoring softly. Jin-woo did not move, but Nia felt his awareness of her like a physical presence, a weight in the room. He was watching her in the reflection of the glass. Just after midnight, a sharp, insistent buzz from the penthouse's private elevator broke the quiet. Jin-woo's head snapped toward the sound, his body instantly alert. The predator was back. Aries was on his feet in a second, a growl vibrating through the floor. "It's all right, boy," Jin-woo murmured, his hand stroking the dog's fur. He pressed a button on the arm of his chair, and a screen flickered to life, showing a security feed of a man in a sharp suit waiting at the elevator door. Jin-woo's expression hardened into a mask of cold granite. He buzzed the man in. The man who stepped into the room was handsome, his smile too smooth. He carried a long, elegantly wrapped gift box. He took in the scene, the ridiculous cake, the untouched food, Jin-woo by the window, and Nia standing in the corner. His eyes lingered on Nia for a beat too long, a flicker of surprise and assessment in their depths. "Jin-woo," the man said, his voice slick. "Forgive my tardiness. I was held up." "Happy birthday." He placed the box on a nearby table. "Min-jun," Jin-woo replied, his tone flat. "You're the first to arrive. And the last." Min-jun's smile didn't falter. "Always the most loyal. You know that." He gestured toward the feast. "A bit much, isn't it? For a quiet evening." The words were laced with poison. Jin-woo ignored the jab. His gaze was fixed on the box. "A gift. From your friends," Min-jun said. "The Vipers. They asked me to deliver it personally. They send their regards." The temperature in the room plummeted. The Vipers were Jin-woo's most bitter rivals, a brutal faction that had been chipping away at his territory since his accident. This wasn't a gift. It was a message. "Open it," Jin-woo commanded, his voice deadly soft.
Minyone's smile finally vanished.
He looked hesitant. He knew what this was. He was a messenger boy in a war. He was supposed to be fighting for Jin-woo. With reluctant fingers, he untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a single, dead viper. Its head was crushed. Around its neck was a small, ornate collar. Aries began to bark, a frantic, furious sound. Nia's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the collar. It belonged to a prized show dog owned by one of Jin-woo's most trusted capos, a man named Park. This was more than a threat. It was a declaration. We can get to anyone. Jinwoo's face was carved from ice. He showed no shock, no anger. Only a terrifying, surgical calm. He wheeled himself closer to the box, his eyes examining the dead snake. "They are sloppy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. This is a gesture of a desperate man. He looked up at Minjun, his gaze pinning the other man in place. "Tell me everything." What followed was a low, tense conversation about shifting allegiances, breached territories, and a betrayal that ran deeper than Jinwoo had suspected. Minjun spoke of weakness, of whispers that the wolf of Gangnam had lost his teeth. Nia stood frozen, an unwilling audience to the machinations of the city's underworld. She was so far out of her depth she couldn't even see the shore. She should have been terrified. And she was. But watching Jinwoo, she felt something else, too. A strange, unwilling admiration. He was a king on a broken throne, yet he commanded the room with more authority than any man she had ever seen. The wheelchair did not diminish him. It focused him, like a lens concentrating the sun into a burning point. Suddenly, Jinwoo's phone, which had been resting on his lap, slipped and clattered to the marble floor, sliding just out of his reach. He swore under his breath, a sharp, guttural sound of frustration. For the first time, a crack appeared in his composure. It was a small thing, but it was a reminder of his physical prison. Minjun made a move to pick it up, but Jinwoo shot him a look that could strip paint from walls. "Don't," he snarled. Before she could think, Nia was moving again. She crossed the room, knelt down, and picked up the sleek black phone. As she rose to hand it to him, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, a spark of warmth against the cold dread that filled the room. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, the world narrowed to the few inches between them. He wasn't looking at his maid. He was looking at a woman. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken question. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the sudden, shocking awareness of him as a man, and her as someone who did not belong here, yet was. He took the phone, his gaze never leaving hers. "Thank you, Nia," he said, and the way he spoke her name was different. It was softer, weighted. It was the first time he had ever shown her a shred of anything resembling warmth. It was a small, almost deniable tenderness, and it was more dangerous than any threat from his enemies. She could have left hours ago. She could have feigned illness when Minjun arrived. But she had stayed. And in doing so, she had made a choice without even realizing it. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the penthouse. It came from the massive window overlooking the river, a spiderweb of cracks erupting from a single, neat hole. Minjun yelled and dove for cover. Ares barked wildly. Nia didn't think. She acted. Her body moved on pure instinct, a primal need to protect the vulnerable thing in the room. She threw herself forward, her hands gripping the handles of Jinwoo's wheelchair, and shoved with all her might. The chair shot backward, away from the window, just as a second bullet slammed into the wall where his head had been moments before. She stumbled, her body half sprawled across his lap, shielding him. The scent of his cologne filled her senses, cedar and smoke. She could feel the hard muscle of his chest against her cheek, the surprising heat of him. For a paralyzed man, he was intensely, terrifyingly alive. His arms came around her, not in comfort, but in a tactical, protective clench, pulling her down, making them a smaller target. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. The world dissolved into chaos. Muted shouts from outside. The sound of his personal security detail swarming the hallways. Minjun was on his own phone, barking orders, his face pale with fear. But in the small circle of Jinwoo's arms, there was a strange, terrifying calm. He was not panicked. He moved through violence like it was a language he was born speaking. One of the attackers, bolder than the rest, managed to breach the apartment itself, slipping in through a service entrance. He was dressed in black, a knife gleaming in his hand. He saw Minjun and dismissed him, his eyes locking on the main target, Jinwoo, trapped in his chair, with a woman sprawled on top of him. He lunged. Nia saw him coming. There was no time to scream, no time for Jinwoo's men to intervene. The mantelpiece. Jinwoo's voice was ice in her ear. To your left. A letter opener. Carved jade. Her eyes darted to the ornate fireplace. She saw it, a decorative, but lethally sharp, jade knife. The attacker was 2 steps away. Get it, Jinwoo ordered. He will come for you first. To get you out of the way. Do not hesitate. She scrambled off him, her movements clumsy with adrenaline. She snatched the heavy, cold object from the mantel just as the man reached her. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. His other hand brought his own knife around, aiming for her stomach. The throat. Jinwoo's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A clinical instruction. She wasn't a killer. She was a maid from a small town who sent money home to her mother every month. But the man's eyes were empty, his intention absolute. It was him or her. Her survival instinct, honed by a life of being careful and overlooked, screamed at her. She twisted, bringing the heavy jade handle down on his wrist, cracking bone. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening. She didn't aim for the throat. She couldn't. Instead, she drove the pointed end of the letter opener deep into the soft muscle of his thigh. He screamed, a raw, animal sound, and collapsed, clutching his leg as blood bloomed through his black trousers. At that moment, 2 of Jinwoo's guards burst in and subdued him, dragging him away. Nia stood there, shaking, the jade knife still clutched in her hand, slick with a stranger's blood. She had crossed a line. A part of her old life, her old self, had just died on the marble floor of this penthouse. She looked at her hands, then at Jinwoo. His expression was unreadable. He wheeled himself closer, his eyes not on the subdued attacker, but on her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the shock in her eyes. He reached out and gently, deliberately, took the bloodied letter opener from her fingers, setting it aside. They saw you, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. They saw you protect me. They will not assume you are just the maid. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. Now you are a target because of me. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. A claim. He was telling her that her old life was over. By staying, by acting, she had tied her fate to his. The war was no longer just his. It was theirs. The days that followed were a blur of gilded captivity. Nia was not allowed to leave the penthouse. Jinwoo's men were a constant, silent presence. Her simple uniform was replaced by clothes he had ordered for her, cashmere sweaters and silk blouses that felt alien against her skin. She was no longer staff, but she was not a guest. She was a complication. A witness. His. He never spoke of the attack, but it lived between them, in the new bulletproof glass that was installed, in the way his guards now flanked every doorway. And it lived in her, in the memory of cold jade and warm blood. She found herself watching him, studying the rigid control he exerted over his empire from his chair. He was ruthless, intelligent, and more isolated than anyone she had ever known. His only companion remained Ares, who had adopted Nia as part of his pack, often resting his head in her lap as she read on the sofa. One evening, she found him in his study, a map of Seoul spread across his desk, marked with the territories of his rivals. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes tight with strain. "You should go," he said without looking up. "I can arrange it. A new life, somewhere far from here. You would be safe." Her heart clenched. It was an offer of freedom. It was what she should have wanted more than anything.
Run.
Forget this world of violence and silence. But the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. Not to him, but to the woman she had become in that moment of shattered glass. "And what would you do?" she asked, her voice quiet. He finally looked up.
I vil handle, mignon.
"I will handle the vipers. It is what I do."
She knew then.
The way he had looked at Minjun that night. He knew his lieutenant was the traitor. He knew Minjun had given the sniper his location. "You're using him," she realized aloud. "You're letting him think he has you fooled." A flicker of something surprise, respect, crossed his face. He is predictable. He will overplay his hand. And when he does, I will cut it off, Jin-woo said simply. She saw his plan then, a cold, calculated trap. And she saw her own small, insignificant part in it. You want them to think I'm your weakness, she said. That's why you're keeping me here. I'm the bait. He did not deny it. The honesty was more brutal than a lie. They think I am sentimental. They think you are my pressure point. They are mistaken. Mistaken about what? She whispered. That you're sentimental, or that I'm your pressure point. The silence between them was not empty. It was a confession. He wheeled himself around the desk until he was directly in front of her. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle. I told myself keeping you here was a strategy, he said, his voice a low murmur. A way to draw out my enemies, his thumb brushed across her bottom lip. I was lying to myself. That was it. The confession. Not of love, but of something far more dangerous. Possession.
Need.
A truth he could no longer deny. The final confrontation happened sooner than she expected. Jin-woo announced that he was sending Nia away to a private airfield. He made sure Min-jun overheard the arrangements. It was the move the traitor had been waiting for. As she was escorted into a black sedan by two of Jin-woo's most loyal men, Nia's stomach twisted with fear. This was the plan. She was the lamb being led to the slaughter. But Jin-woo had armed her with more than just the knowledge of the trap. He had armed her with his trust. The attack came on the approach to the airport, a quiet stretch of industrial road.
2 cars boxed them in.
Men with guns emerged. But Jin-woo's men were prepared. The firefight was short and brutal. In the chaos, Nia did exactly what she had been instructed not to do. Instead of staying in the car, she slipped out the opposite door and ran. Not away from the danger, but back toward it. She flagged down a taxi, her voice shaking but firm as she gave the address for the penthouse. She arrived to find the private elevator unlocked. The apartment was deathly quiet. She knew Min-jun would be here, thinking Jin-woo was alone and distracted. She moved silently through the foyer. In the main living area, she saw them. Min-jun stood over Jin-woo's wheelchair, a gun in his hand. It's over, Jin-woo. Your sentimentality was your undoing. A nobody made from America. She was the crack in your armor. Jin-woo looked up at him, his face a mask of cold fury. You were my brother, Min-jun. And you were a king who could no longer stand, Min-jun sneered, raising the gun. Nia acted. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a brain. She ran to the main control panel on the wall, the one for the penthouse's integrated systems, and slammed her hand on the fire alarm. A deafening klaxon blared through the space, and emergency sprinklers erupted from the ceiling, dousing them all in cold water. The sudden chaos was all the distraction Jin-woo needed. Min-jun flinched, turning toward the sound for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Jin-woo's hand went to the side of his wheelchair. A hidden compartment sprang open, and his hand emerged with a pistol. He was faster than Min-jun, his movements economical and lethal. One shot. Center mass. Min-jun crumpled to the floor. The alarm stopped as suddenly as it had started. The only sounds were the hiss of the sprinklers and Nia's ragged breathing. She stood drenched and shaking, looking at the body on the floor, then at Jin-woo. He was soaked, his tailored suit ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead. But his eyes, when they found hers, were blazing with a fierce, undeniable emotion. You came back, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of awe. You knew I would, she replied, water dripping from her chin. A cost had been paid. He had purged the traitor, but in doing so, had exposed his methods to the entire underworld. His enemies knew he was still dangerous, but they also knew he had someone to protect. He was stronger and more vulnerable than ever before. Later, after his men had come and gone, cleaning up the mess with silent efficiency, the two of them sat in the quiet, water-damaged room. The ruined birthday cake still sat on the island, a monument to the night everything changed. Nia was cleaning a small cut on the back of his hand, A shard of glass had grazed him during the confrontation. Her touch was gentle. He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When she finished, she made to pull her hand away, but he caught it, his fingers lacing with hers. His grip was firm. A promise.
A chain.
Stay, he said.
It was not a command this time.
And it was more than a request. It was the sound of a man who had been alone in the dark for a very long time finally admitting he needed the light. Nia looked at their joined hands, then into his dark, searching eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She simply tightened her grip and stayed.